Good afternoon, and thank y'all for coming. And it's going to be Chief Joseph and the Long Trail. He covered some 1,003 miles in 126 days. The National Park Service had this to say about the Nez Perce War. Nez Perce War was a result of a cultural conflict. As the United States expanded westward, the settlers felt it was their manifest destiny to take the land. The Nez Perce hoped only to preserve theirs. The war seemed unavoidable. It's a dramatic example of the price paid in human lives for the westward expansion of our nation. You may have heard my talk in 2022 on the Reno battlefield above the Little Bighorn. And there's some similarities, I believe, between the Sioux War of 1876 and the Nez Perce War of 77. Here's a comparison I made. The Sioux War. The 1868 treaty at Fort Laramie designated a permanent Indian reservation in the Black Hills in the heart of the reservation. This was sacred land, the Black Hills. The Nez Perce. The 1855 treaty, a spacious reservation, included most of the ancestral land parts of Oregon, Washington, and Idaho territories. The Sioux. In 1874, gold was discovered and gold seekers swarmed on the reservation. The Nez Perce. In 1860, gold was discovered, and the gold miners and settlers swarmed in on the reservation. The Sioux. The Sioux and others wouldn't sell the Black Hills. The Nez Perce. Some tribes signed a new treaty in 1863, reducing the reservation to 1/10 the size of the original reservation. The chiefs whose lands laid within the reservation reluctantly signed the treaty. Those whose land fell outside the treaty, which was 1/3 or 5 bands of the Nez Perce Indians, refused and became known as the treaty or the non-treaty Nez Perce. The Sioux. In December 1875, the Bureau of Indian Affairs ordered tribes to return before January 31st, 1875. They had 30 days to comply. The Nez Perce. The non-treaties were ordered in mid-May 1877 to be on the reservation within 30 days. This was by order of the Indian Bureau. The Sioux. When the Indians didn't comply, military force was to be used. Some Indians didn't get the word. Some were so far out they weren't going to get back to the reservation in 30 days. And some of them just flat weren't going to come back. They didn't want any reservation life. So began the Sioux War of 1876. For the Nez Perce, military came in to enforce the law in 1877. Some Indians did not have time to get to the reservation. There's swollen rivers, they're moving women and children, aged people, and they didn't get back in time if they wanted to, and so began the Nez Perce War of 1877. Mark Twain said one time, "History does not repeat itself, it rhymes." The Nez Perce discovered Lewis and Clark. Usually you hear about the Lewis and Clark discovering the Nez Perce, but it wasn't, according to Charlie Russell. There's a big painting in a capitol there in Helena, Montana, where he called the Indians, the Nez Perce discovered Lewis and Clark. And that happened in 1805. And they were occupying what is now Idaho and Washington. They're known in past history to hang ornaments from their noses, which is the way they got their name. But they were peaceful hunters and fishermen, but vicious fighters when necessary. They had been friendly with the whites for 50 years prior to 1877. During that time, some whites killed Nez Perce. But during that 50 years, no Nez Perce ever killed a white man. This matter of record. So when Oregon was settled, the Nez Perce ceded all their lands except the Walla Walla Valley in Oregon and large sections of Idaho, and lived peacefully. Again, gold hunters, disregarding the treaty, swarmed in on the reservation. They were moved bodily out of the homeland to the Lapua Reservation in Idaho. The Southern Nez Perce would not sign the treaty. In 1877, General O. Howard, considered a true friend of the Nez Perce, was ordered to round up the Indians, the non-agency Indians, and put them on a reservation. Howard called a council at Fort Lapua. Chief Joseph did not attend. He sent his younger brother, Olcott, and 5 other chiefs. Howard insisted that Joseph come, which Joseph later did, and he was impressed with Joseph's intellectual fencing, as he put it. Howard's patience became frayed when he got into an argument with Tu Hol Soti, a dreamer priest. He had him arrested. Joseph, Olcott, Whitebird, Hush Hush Cote, and Looking Glass left the council immediately, and the Nez Perce were indignant about the arrest of their priest. That's Olcott in the center there. There's Whitebird. That's Chief Looking Glass. Five days later, to secure the high priest's release, Joseph unwillingly said he would go on the reservation. He's thinking it was the best thing to do for his people, bring his people to a reservation. While preparing to move, the Nez Perce took affairs out of his hands. Among these young warriors, there's always some hotheads, and 3 warriors, one of which, whose father was killed by a drunk white man, and 2 other warriors, young warriors, were whipped. They went on a warpath. They killed a rancher, and the next day they killed 3 more settlers. And when they came back into camp, waving their scalps and hollering for war and all that, 17 other young warriors decided to join. So now you got 20 young warriors on the warpath. They killed something like 18 whites. Well, now, Joseph was away at the time, and when he came back, heard all this, well, there wasn't much he could do. And he protested, but in vain. He ended up having to go leave the reservation. He had to stay with the tribe. As the first messenger reached Fort Lapua with the news of the Salmon Valley Massacre, that's what they call that, General Howard sent 2 troops of 1st Cavalry under Captains Perry and Trimble to protect the settlers and punish the Indians. The Indians have always been peaceful, so they didn't think there'd be any conflict at all. They entered Whitebird Canyon, which is 80 miles away from the fort. It so happened that the Nez Perce were camped in that very canyon, and the canyon was slightly timbered, and there's a lot of brush there, and it opened widely into the Salmon River Valley. Perry went with 100 men down the canyon looking for hostiles. Nez Perce discovered Perry miles up the canyon, and Joseph now took command in his first battle. Joseph had 200 warriors divided in 2 groups. One group under Whitebird hid in the brush to one side of the canyon, and the other bunch lined the buttes at the opening of the valley. Lieutenant Feller, with 8 troopers, somewhat in advance of Perry and Trimble, commands rode into a well-set trap. Perry and Trimble's command rode into the trap. After that, Feller had to run from rifle fire, and he was charged by a well-mounted horseman. Perry and Trimble galloped up and wheeled into line, and on the left in a high bluff, Perry and scouts sat up to make their marksmanship felt. Perry thought he had won the battle after the wounded Nez Perce fell back. A blast of fire from Whitebird's group knocked over several troopers. The flanking movement drove the Army sharpshooters off the bluff. Trimble, driven back, left Sergeant McCarthy and 6 men behind. Trimble charged again and brought them back, but the sergeant had already lost two troopers. The rearward movement became a panic retreat. Trimble, with 16 troopers, remained as a rear guard, moving out after Perry got the last of his men out. Then he followed. The retreat failed when Joseph swooped down and killed Feller and 36 of his troopers. Indian loss was slight as they fought mainly from cover. That evening, the Nez Perce moved across the Salmon River, forestalling Howard's prompt march with 300 men. Howard found Joseph on the other side of the river. They sat there and looked at each other for a long time. Joseph had all the crossings covered, and there was no way Howard could have crossed the river without losing a lot of men. And Howard said, quote, "No general could have chosen a safer position or one more likely to puzzle and obstruct a foe." Joseph had 200 warriors against 300 soldiers. Howard dispatched a Major Whipple with 2 troops of cavalry to intercept Looking Glass band who was trying to come up to help Joseph. Joseph descended the heights after dark. Looking Glass was sparring with Whipple. Whipple found Joseph was now above him and surrounding him, and Whipple saw that he had set up a defense on Cottonwood Creek. His 2 scouting parties were cut up with Lieutenant Raines and 11 men killed. Howard untangled himself from the mountains after 24 hours to find Joseph had gone. Joseph, with Looking Glass followers, now had 250 fighters. Problem was, in addition to that, they had 450 women, children, and elderly, and they had 2,000 ponies. Howard presented the loss of the supply train when the main force came up to relieve him. He saved his. At nightfall, Joseph held the riverbanks in the only spring, and the soldiers that night slept thirsty. With the help of a howitzer and 2 Gatling guns, the Indians were driven back, but later, they drove the soldiers back. The score was 13 dead and 27 wounded soldiers, and 23 dead and 46 wounded Nez Perce, due chiefly to artillery fire. That's what Wellington would have called a butcher's bill at Waterloo. At Klamath Falls, a decision had to be made. Joseph and his chief sat in council to decide to surrender or go to Canada for safety. Before Chief Joseph's father passed away, on his deathbed, he called his son Inmut Tuya Ya Lot Lot, which means thunder traveling over the mountains, who later on became Chief Joseph. He gave the above advice to old Joseph, they call him. "My son, the old body is returning to my mother earth, and my spirit is going away soon to see the great spirit chief, the chief of these people. Guide them, and always remember that your father never sold his country, never sell the bones of your father and mother." Joseph said later, "I said in my heart that I would give up my country, I would give up my father's grave, I would give up everything. They have the blood of my people on my hands. I love that land more than all the world. A man who would not love his father's grave is a wild animal. Their decision would involve a retreat of 1,300 miles and hard fighting while being pursued. His decision made, Joseph made a speech, quote, "Some of you tried to say once that I was afraid of the whites. Stay with me, and you shall get your bellies full with fighting." Joseph now struck into the unknown and barren country with his flocks, herds, women, children, old and weak. He posted a rear guard that delayed Howard for a day and started up the Lolo Pass. Lolo Pass goes from Idaho into Montana. My son was there on a business trip there in Idaho, and he went down the highway. It's a good highway, of course. And he said it looks pretty bad there. A lot of boulders, a lot of deadfall, a lot of waterfall, and all that. The pass crossed the Montana mountain with the jagged rocks. Trails were slippery from almost constant rain. Troops unencumbered with camp baggage averaged 16 miles per day. Joseph and his people gradually pulled away from them. At the pass, they went down into the plains of the Coeur d'Alene. They found a hastily constructed fort, calling it later Fort Fizzle. There's a Captain Ron there and 60 men, and he was told to keep Joseph from going further than where Fort Fizzle was. Fort Fizzle was just logs and rocks piled up. And he confronted Joseph, and Joseph said, "We're going by you without fighting if you will let us, but we're going by you anyhow." Kind of sassy in a way. He then made a noisy feint in front of the fort and went around the fort, and Ron saw better things, and he and his men hightailed it to Fort Missoula. That was the end of that. Joseph committed no depredations. As they went into Montana, they traded in several towns. They traded for horses, guns, and ammunition. The military really got ticked off about that. I want to know, why would you do that? And the answer was, they didn't harm us. They didn't want to fight us. They didn't steal anything. So why shouldn't we trade with them? This gave a false impression to Joseph. He thought maybe the war was over. But later, John Gibbon of the 7th Infantry out of Fort Shaw, Montana, that's at Great Falls now, it wasn't Great Falls then, he planned to cut the Nez Perce off. The Indians, after the friendly trading again, thought everything was okay, but here's Gibbon coming down after them. And they camped peacefully, these Indians, in a little meadow on a Big Hole River. There were willows and underbrush, and higher up on the side of the mountain were pine trees. August 7th in the morning, now after a long journey from Oregon and Idaho, and now Montana, Chief Looking Glass chose an old campsite to stay and recoup. They thought they were enough ahead of Howard in danger. Looking Glass did not post guards. Now a second military force under Gibbon and 162 men of the 7th Infantry, plus 34 civilian volunteers, came up on the campground, the Nez Perce campground. They were within 200 yards of the teepees, and they formed a skirmish line, and they on the west bank of the North Fork of the Big Hole River. At first light, they attacked. A young horse herder saw these soldiers, and he let out an alarm, but he was killed in turn. The troopers crossed the river In the pre-dawn light, they killed indiscriminately men, women, and children. Chiefs Looking Glass and Whitebird took up sniper positions that forced the soldiers back across the river, and they would stay there for 24 hours. Captain Logan's troop penetrated the furthest. He got in a tangle with a warrior. They both shot at each other. The warrior missed. Logan shot killed the Nez Perce. The Nez Perce's sister came along, picked up his revolver, and went over and shot Logan in the head, and he was killed. Gibbon and 2 lieutenants were wounded. The detachment led by Lieutenant James Bradley was killed. He's the one that discovered the bodies on Custer Hill at the Little Bighorn. He was a chief of scouts under Gibbon coming up the Yellowstone River at that time in June of 76. Gibbon had a 12-pound howitzer that had fallen behind. During the march, the gun was located on the hillside. 30 Nez Perce charged the gun. The gun crew ran off. Nez Perce took the wheels off the gun and rolled the wheels down the mountainside. And that was the end of that. They did get off 2 shots, the gun crew did. In the darkness, the Indians withdrew. They crossed the river, and on the 10th, and there weren't any Indians in that area, but on the 11th, there weren't any around at all, anywhere within miles. These soldiers, they were in bad shape there. They had a dead horse there. They're eating it raw. They couldn't build any couldn't build any fire. Joseph struck his lodges. He packed baggage and moved out. By the 10th, the last Nez Perce left. He was thankful Gibbon when he saw Howard's men coming to rescue him. This was a switch here because at the Little Bighorn, Gibbon relieved Reno. Maybe that's history rhymes there. Joseph had won again, but a costly victory. He lost 89 dead, and 50 of those were women and children. Looking Glass's daughter and 2 of Joseph's wives were killed. Also killed were 2 of the 3 young warriors that were responsible for the Salmon Valley Massacre. 29 soldiers dead and 40 wounded. 7 men won the Medal of Honor, and all the officers there were breveted in promotion. Gibbon said of the Nez Perce stand, quote, a gallant struggle. Moving southward, Nez Perce scouts kept an eye on Howard's movements. That brought them, they brought word that a detachment of troops under a lieutenant had been after them, and Joseph wanted to use some speed and direction and to get out of there. And at Camas Meadows in Idaho, on 8/20 at night, 40 warriors riding in a column of 4s came into camp. This is coming in at Howard's camp. Column of 4s. What you see in a lot of these westerns are columns of 2s. Like John Ford, there are always 2 men. This is 4 men. So if a column of 2s covers, say, 4/10 of a mile, well, then a column of 4s is only 2/10 of a mile. So anybody that was called in for an officer's call had less distance to ride. Got the message faster that way. These 40 warriors came in. They thought it was the scouting party that had gone out to look for a pass. So after the shooting started, and they were killing Indians and killing soldiers, and the horses weren't driven off, but the mules were. The horses were tethered. So upon leaving, the 40 Nez Perce followed by Howard's troops, were led into a cul-de-sac. Firing from three sides, they killed one man and wounded seven. Howard had saved them from the worst when he came up, and plus the darkness of the night. Howard was ceased following. He had wounded to care for, had no pack train because the mules had gone, and he needed to get supplies from Virginia City, Montana. Joseph moved through Thatcher's Pass into Yellowstone National Park, following the Madison River. Yellow Wolf Joseph's cousin, took tourists George and Emma Cowan and sister and brother Frank and Ida Carpenter captives. Gave them instructions to leave. Leanell, responsible for the march, kept an eye on the tourists and an eye on the young warriors seeking revenge for the Big Hole fight. He told the Cowans to leave. While getting the young warriors, while talking to them, the young warriors surrounded them, and they stopped. The Cowans, they shot George Cowan in the leg and shot him in the head. They took Emma Cowan and the Carpenters back into custody. The good guys did, and they left George laying on a trail there. They thought he was dead. So the Indians and captives continued across Yellowstone Park, crossing Hayden Valley, following the Yellowstone River. That evening, Joseph and Leanell discerned the fate of the captives. Discussed the fate of the captives. The next morning, Leanell took the captives with two horses and told them, "Go quick." The tourists got away. They ran into an army detachment, told them how many Nez Perce there were and what condition they thought they were in, whether starving or what. The next day, Looking Glass and Joseph split in two. They entered the Lamar Valley and abandoned cut and injured horses. They turned east out of the park. Howard followed slowly with wagons. They found George Cowan, who would survive the injuries, and placed him in a wagon. On September 4th, Howard reached the Yellowstone River and sent wagons and teamsters back, and now used pack mules. It was pretty rough country for wagons, so pack mules was the answer. Down in Yellowstone, eastward, close, Lieutenant Sam Sturgis with 450 7th Cavalrymen and several Crow Scouts out of Fort Keogh around Miles City. They came in to help out. Joseph went into the Yellowstone National Park, crossed the Absaroka Range, Clarks Fork River, and gave Howard and Sturgis the slip on September 8th. Back in Montana, Leanell was still in charge of the daily travel, and he was turned down by the Crows, their old allies. And the Crows, scouted for Custer, and I don't think they wanted any problems in fighting. Fighting Sioux and Cheyenne is one thing, but they didn't want to fight their friends or the Nez Perce, so they said, "No, we can't stay here." Nez Perce wanted to stay on the Yellowstone River in the buffalo country. But Crow said, "No, don't do it." So now the Nez Perce would have to go 300 more miles to get to Canada and Sitting Bull. Sturgis was in striking distance. Howard was pushing from behind. The 7th gave chase and overtook the Nez Perce at Canyon Creek in Montana on September 13th. An interesting thing is that in August, William Tecumseh Sherman was touring the park at that time. He just barely missed the Nez Perce. That would have been a feather in their hat if they'd caught him. The fight at Canyon Creek was short and hot. Joseph's rear guard allowed some children and camp equipment to escape. Two soldiers were riding into an ambush, firing from both sides of the canyon. Sturgis lost 3 dead and 12 wounded. He had 350 troopers against 100 Indians. Joseph retreated that night. The army did not pursue due to the wounded. The Nez Perce lost 21 braves, killed and wounded, and lost 900 ponies, captured by the Crow Scouts. Howard played out men and horses and short of supplies, asked Colonel Nelson Miles of the cantonment on the Tongue River in eastern Montana to prevent their escape or hold them in check until he could get there and prevent their escape to Canada. Miles, familiar with the country, began pursuit on September 18th. He knew that country because he had chased Sitting Bull into Canada, which the Indians called the Medicine Line. And he was keeping an eye on them, making sure Bull didn't come back. Bull was a wanted person after the Little Bighorn. And Miles knew the territory really well. And Nez Perce was just 80 miles from Canada when Looking Glass assumed command, assumed command, replacing Lean Elk. They traveled at a slow pace, another 40 miles, then camped on Snake Creek around the Bear Paw Mountains. This was at noon on September 29th. Late that evening, scouts reported to Miles, who with his 500 men were informed they had located the trail and camped nearby. Joseph and his daughter, Sound and Running Water, were at the horse herd that morning of the 30th, and they saw these Cheyenne scouts come riding in along with some 7th Cavalrymen. The camp was cut in two. They captured nearly all the horses and surrounded the camp. Fighting was at close range. Troopers that fell in camp had their ammunition and guns confiscated. The Nez Perce repulsed the army 3 times. Dozens of Miles' men were killed or wounded. Several Indian leaders had been killed, including Olcott, Lean Elk, and 2 Hoo-Hoo Zoti. Some families divided and fled to Canada, and some were captured by an army because they were reluctant to leave the wounded. The battle became a siege. The next 5 days of intermittent negotiations and fighting, and 4 chiefs killed. Joseph met directly with Miles and was held in a soldier camp against his will. After a time, he was released in trade for soldiers in the Indian camp. He met Whiteberg and Looking Glass to make a decision. During this time, Looking Glass was killed by a military sharpshooter. Whiteberg and Joseph decided to follow their own paths. Joseph surrendered and made a speech, and you've heard this probably several times. Tell General Howard, I know his heart. What he told me before, I have it in my heart. I'm tired of fighting. Our chiefs are killed. Looking Glass is dead. Hoo-Hoo Zoti is dead. The old men are all dead. It is the young men that say yes and no. He's referring to the council votes. He who held the young men, Olcott is dead. He who led the young men, Olcott, is dead. It's his younger brother again. It is cold and we have no blankets. The little children are freezing to death. My people, some of them have run away to the hills and have no blankets, no food. No one knows where they are, perhaps freezing to death. I want to have time to look for my children and see how many of these I can find. Maybe I shall find them among the dead. Hear me, my chiefs. I am tired, my heart is sick and sad. From where the sun now stands, I will fight no more forever. I think at one time, back in the 40s and 50s probably, some children had to learn Washington's farewell address or the Gettysburg Address, but I think up in the Northwest, they learned this one. Joseph handed Miles his rifle butt first. This is a this is a sketch by G.M. Holland. He's a war correspondent, so it's probably pretty accurate. Joseph, of the 700 Indians who had camped along Snake Creek, 25 died, 40 were wounded on the battlefield, 448 were POWs, and the remainder, 200 or so, reached Canada, the medicine line. Military losses were 24 dead, including a captain and 2 lieutenants, 42 wounded, including Captains Moylan and Godfrey, veterans of the Reno Hill. At the end, Joseph never commanded more than 300 warriors, had opposed 5,000 soldiers, plus hundreds of civilians. He actually met in battle 2,000 troopers. Of these, he had killed 265. His own loss is 239 men, women, and children. He had marched at least 1,300 miles in 126 days through enemy country without a supply train, with non-combatants, and came within 30 miles of Canada. Whitebird and many followers, including Joseph's 12-year-old daughter, successfully reached Saskatchewan 2 days later. 87 warriors and 254 women and children were forced marched to Fort Keogh, Montana, by boat to Fort Abraham Lincoln, Dakota Territory, and then to Fort Leavenworth, Kansas, and then Indian Territory, which the Indians called the Hot Place. Joseph traveled by trailer to settle on the Colville Reservation in eastern Washington. Miles' influence had something to do with this move. Miles said, considering the Nez Perce, quote, a very bright and energetic body of Indians, indeed the most intelligent that I have ever seen, exceedingly self-reliant. Each man seemed to be able to do his own thinking and to be purely democratic and independent in his own ideas and purposes. Joseph adapted to the white man's way of education and industry. He died in 1904. So ended the Nez Perce War. I want to thank Joyce Gray and Sarah Ross and Carol Cummings for the aiding these series here. And that's it. If you got any questions, I'll try to answer them.